could all join us today for this Inclusive Libraries Practical Strategies for Disability Justice webinar. I want to remind the audience, and you probably heard it just recently, that this webinar is being recorded and it's going to be available at a later date. And that's going to be on that YouTube channel for the STS section. The link to the webinar will also be sent out to all registrants. So you can always view this webinar later. Today's webinar is a panel discussion regarding practical strategies for disability justice. We have a series of questions to ask our three panelists that have joined us today, and we're going to end our webinar with a Q&A session. So, as we go, please enter any questions you have into the Q&A box. A member of the STS EDI Committee will be monitoring the Q&A. You also have the option to place your question anonymously if you would like. And if you don't see the Q&A button, it might be under the More. So if you click More, that you might see at the bottom of your screen on Zoom, you should be able to see the Q&A option. If you want to direct any of your questions for a specific panelist, please list their name in your question. This webinar is going to last around an hour, ending at around 2 p.m. unless we go a little longer with questions, but that's kind of the goal, 2 p.m. So now to introduce myself, my name is Erica Newcomb. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the STEM and Interdisciplinary Research Librarian at the University of Miami. I am a committee member of the ACRL STS Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Committee. And I'm going to be your moderator today for our panel, and we have a great panel. So I'm looking forward to it, and I hope you all are as well. Just to give a physical description of myself, I am a Caucasian woman in my 30s. I have blue eyes and brown hair. I'm wearing a green top with a black cardigan today. Now, in this webinar, our three panelists are going to discuss practical strategies for creating inclusive curricula, fostering cultures of mutual care, and advocating for systematic change institutionally and in libraries. For our three panelists today that I get to introduce, first I have Dr. Katie Vaughan. She is the Hall F. and Barbra Buckner Higginbotham University Librarian and Professor at Washington and Lee University Library. Next up, I have Tammy Stitz, who is the Engineering Librarian at George Mason University. Finally, we have Lauren Kehoe, who is Head of Research Engagement at University of Central Florida. I'd also like to invite each panelist to provide a visual description of themselves if they would like to.
Sure, and I'll go first. I'm Katie Vaughan. I apologize for the very long title that I have. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a newly 50-year-old white woman with prematurely gray hair. I'm wearing a black dress and a scarf that I picked out specially for my STS peeps. It has a picture of a purple nebulae with stars on it.
I can go ahead and go next. This is Tammy Stitz, and I am 54, and I have dark hair pulled back, and I have hoop earrings on and black shirt and some glasses.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Kehoe. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a white woman in her 40s with long brown hair wearing a black shirt.
All right, so we're going to move on to our series of questions that we have for the panelists. So I'm going to ask a question to each panelist individually today, and then other panelists can follow up on that question. And for our first question, I'm going to start with, so this is for KT. How can libraries foster a culture of belonging and mutual care for disabled students, and what steps can be taken to ensure accessibility is at the core of library services and management?
So I will admit that whole books are written about this one question. And I'm going to try to give some thoughts about it in just a few short minutes. In a lot of research that I've done and that various other people have done, one of the things that we found about working with disabled students, working with disabled faculty staff and our own staff is that disability and accessibility don't happen one time, and they don't happen in one experience. And so we've learned that one of the most important things that we need to do to make people feel like they belong in the library is to see them, to hear them, and to value them. So the seen, heard, valued concept is one that is common across lots of different management theories, but it really comes to play in thinking about accessibility. The other thing that we talk about a lot in accessibility services is that there's the rallying cry of the disability movement since about the 1970s has been nothing about us without us. And so one of the things that I did not describe about myself is that I am a disabled woman. I have a number of joint related issues that are both genetic and also because of accidents and overuse as a teenager. And so I feel that I can represent my disability, but I do not have disabilities in other spaces. And so one of the ways that we make sure that people are seen, heard, and valued is to reach out to colleagues and to students and people in the community to talk to them. It's really important that we don't guess what is useful to people, but that we ask and that we keep asking. Because one of the things that we know from library research is that it's one thing to get people into the building. We can have buttons on our doors that make it easier to open the doors. We can have flat entrances. We can have signage that is large and does not use colors. We can have lights that don't buzz weirdly at people, right? We can do all of these things that are physical changes to our space. But if people come in and are treated badly, they won't come back. And so the main thing that we have to do is to really think about that sense of belonging as a cultural and a social thing. And that comes down to things like training people on what to do, inviting in members of the committee to tell us what, of the community rather, to tell us what we're doing well or poorly. And so we think about this as accessibility, not just being about physical accessibility, but being about that environment. We think about it not just in the first time that the person comes in, but every time after that. And then we also think about disabilities as not just being one thing, but as being a multi-dimensional continuum of being. So any given person has got something about them that is different from what we might think of as the norm. And that's because there is no ideal person. That person does not exist. And we're not trying to be perfect people. We want to see all of the people around us as individuals who all deserve respect and deserve access to the library to answer the questions that they're trying to get answered. And so that comes down to really thinking differently about the people in front of us and seeing them as those individuals and asking them what they need. That's my really short version of this, but we can go into that. I think that's what we're going to talk about for a lot of the rest of our session.
Thank you, Katie. And I want to open it up to anyone else on the panel if they want to follow up on that or have their own other answers that they'd like to know.
This is Lauren, and just wanting to add that our professional organizations very much kind of offer support for this too, and looking to ALA and our other accrediting kind of professional organizations and seeing the ethics and values that they put out there and emulating that. And I know just again, kind of making it part of the culture, really just ensuring that you're in conversation both with those who identify as having disabilities, but in management and in your teams, just making sure that accessibility is always talked about and thought of. Thank you.
Right. So moving on to our next question, what resources, frameworks, or models can library use to better integrate disability justice into their mission? And again, this question is for Katie.
Sure. So I want to talk about 3 specific things that I use in my management practice when thinking about how do I try to make things more accessible across the board. And one of them will be the one that I think most of us know a lot about and that we'll be talking about a lot more, which is universal design. I'm gonna get to that one third. So the first thing that I think about is really leading from a place of authenticity. And in that case, what I'm thinking about is how am I presenting my own disabilities in a way that are understandable to people and that help them see that I am a valuable person who has rights and who deserves respect, but also has something that may be a different experience of the world from the people around me. And then also, how do I value that authenticity in other people? The second thing that I think a lot about are ethics of care, which is a feminist based model in which we center wellness and we center empathy and we center this concept of the whole person as having value in front of us. And so we think about, how do I want to treat the people around me, and how do I want the people around me to feel as if they are part of a network of people together. So in authenticity, what we might see in the library is that we say, we need to create a new policy. How do we create it with the people who are going to be most affected by this policy, or the people who are going to put this policy into place? How do they be part of that whole piece? And so when we created our remote work policy, I did not write the remote work policy. I would have written it for me. Instead, we pushed it out to the people around us and said, what do you all need out of a remote work policy? And let's center this in who we are as individuals. In ethics of care, that can come into place with things like, do we actually need to have exactly the same furniture for each individual staff member? Or are there things that are more or less useful for people based on their individual mental and physical needs? So I am tall as a woman, I'm tall, and I need a different height of desk and chair than some of our faculty who are significantly shorter than me. And so we're not trying to put any judgments on tallness versus shortness. We just want to say, what do you need to make your life better? And then there is the universal design principles. So universal design comes from a specific model within disability. I can talk for hours about models of disability, but there's one called the social model, which has been around for a while. It's a critical model within disability, and it says that disability really becomes a problem when a person's individual characteristics butts up against what's often called a barrier in society, and that it is the responsibility of the society or of the institutions to try to reduce those barriers. And so the social model of disability then leads to this concept of universal design. And in a nutshell, and I'm going to make a quote here from the Center for Excellence in Universal Design. I'll stick their link in just a second. Universal design is the design and composition of an environment so that it can be accessed, understood, and used to the greatest extent possible by all people, regardless of their size, ability, age, or disability. And there are 7 principles in there. They have to do with equity, flexibility, simplicity, perceptibility, error tolerance, low effort, and sufficient size and space for use. Again, I'll put a URL in for that. But the thing is that with universal design, we as librarians are responsible for making sure that we're not doing things that then interact badly with other people's disabilities. We also see something similar called universal design for learning, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit later. And that talks about recognizing that different people have different ways of interacting with a space. And so how can we come up with multiple different models for how people can be successful? So those are some of the frameworks that I think about a lot. One example of how we've incorporated universal design has been in thinking about our signage in the library. Now, a lot of times people are like, we're going to put Braille on our signs, and that's great. You should do that. But also you should make sure that your signs are legible from a fair distance away. And that they are easily understood by people who maybe don't speak English, because a lot of us in academic libraries, we have students who are coming from international origins, and so maybe their English is not sufficient to understand what you're trying to say. So we've done a lot of work thinking about the signage that we have in the library to try to make it easier for people to understand. One of the wonderful things about universal design is that when you do it right, it makes it easier for everybody. So one of the things we've done in this is we've turned on closed captions. I now watch everything on TV with closed captions because I watch a lot of British murder mysteries and I don't understand a Scottish accent. And so when we turn on the closed captions, that may be originally designed for people who are hard of hearing, and yet they're also useful for the rest of us. So that's one of the wonderful things about universal design that I appreciate. The thing, though, that I would caution about leaning too heavily on universal design is that you really want to pair it with something like ethics of care, because Universal design does not solve every problem that people who have accessibility problems have. And I'll just point out that 2 of us are wearing glasses right now. And glasses are something that's related to something called the medical model of disability, which says that disabilities have solutions available to us in the medical world that we should be using to reduce the impact of that disability. Oftentimes we see this as a bad thing. People really don't like the medical model because it treats often disabled people as if they're broken. And I don't think I'm broken, but I do need my glasses to be able to see the screen. And because I have my glasses, I can participate in this. So we do need to think about both universal design and also these other pieces that recognize that people are human, and also that we're living in the 21st century and we have ways to make things better for everybody if we choose to use them.
Thank you, Katie. So I want to open it up to the rest of the panel if you wanted to respond to that question. Or we also have kind of a follow-up since Katie brought up that universal design. So how can libraries apply the principles of universal design to collections, programming, and technology services? So this would be for Lauren and Tammy, if you want to respond to that, or to the question before for number.
Thanks so much. This is Lauren. I'll maybe respond to the first 2 pieces of collections and programming. So just some thoughts around the way we can consider this in our collections. You know, that the built environment of our spaces, right, are very high and narrow book stacks, and thinking through the kind of physical implications of that and what ways can we design our spaces that maybe make the access to those materials more universally accessible, or what kind of, you know, book delivery services can we offer, kind of thinking through those methods of our services and kind of physical spaces. I also want to mention the types of collections we build, right, and offering multiple formats. We can't just have physical books and we can't just have digital books anymore because folks need different ways of engaging. They need different types of information to engage in different ways. So that also goes to beyond the kind of physical and digital format, but audiobooks. I know in an academic library setting where I've mostly spent my career, we don't always think about audiobooks as being part of our collections, but I'd really like to see academic libraries consider that format too as an accessibility need. And as well, to the point about the captions, like I do everything with captions as well too, and have really taken to audiobooks lately just as a way to kind of hear the reading aloud. I also want to say the platforms that we use to access these materials, whether it's our discovery platforms or the databases that we're subscribing to, wanting to really advocate for those to be accessible and being robust and kind of operable by multiple browsers, by multiple types of software and hardware, and also just to work with the users. I think this gets to something Katie kind of framed for us early on about working with our communities, and especially bringing in the voices of those who are disabled in our community and ask them what formats they need, and really trying to kind of work with them to understand how we can build our collections. And then some of the thoughts I have around programming would be to consider offering programs that center individuals with disabilities. You know, maybe if you're doing a history of technology program, and you know, putting forward individuals who identify as having disabilities who are instrumental in kind of the history of science, technology, and engineering. You also want to, when planning the program, make sure, and also inviting folks in, like we did for this panel, you know, give the description and ask for questions and provide as much information about what to expect as possible in the programming to give folks time to kind of understand it and think through, you know, what will be offered. And then lastly, just something I've really been thinking a lot about lately is offering sensory friendly experiences. Again, Katie, I think, brought up some stuff about lighting and furniture considerations, and that goes the same for programs, right? And also if we're offering audiovisual elements in our programming, and just kind of trying to think through the different ways people might engage with information in different ways, and offering different sensory modifications or ability to modify the sensory experience. And then I'll pass the mic over to Tammy. Thank you.
Thank you. This is Tammy, and I'm really going to talk about the similarities between the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and I'm going to call it WCAG from now on, and the Universal Design for Learning, because I always think of universal design as more for space, and then for learning, I thought that might go along with like you said, that they're similar, but it'll go along with the web stuff. So as I said, there's similarities between those two. And WCAG operates under the concept of POUR, which I think that was mentioned earlier today too. So that means content should be perceivable, and it should be operable, understandable, and robust. And if I look at perceivable according to the WCAG, then the idea is those with various skills and abilities should be able to perceive the content. And that would go along with alternate descriptions for images. And they have to be appropriate ones too, because if it's not useful, it's as bad as not having one. Also the captions, those were mentioned because we, aside from not being able to hear what I'm saying, also, if you're in a noisy environment like a airport or something, you read the captions, and that's really helpful. And another one example of that, there's many more examples, but another example would be content relationships. So you want to make sure if your content are related to each other, it's very, very clear how they're related and what's related. And then for UDL, there's multiple means of representation, and the design option perception really speaks to WCAG's perceivable directly. I mean, they're very, very related. So I'm going to consider understandable, and the design options for language and symbols relates to the WCAG concept of understandable. It's really wider for the WCAG. So you kind of, it's related, but you kind of jump around the universal design for learning. So, defining acronyms and unfamiliar terms, which we've heard, probably in English all our lives, but it's really important so people know what you mean. And UDL, multiple means of action and expression. They have a design option for interaction and another design option for expression and communication. And there's a predictability that's under the understandable in the WCAG, and interaction, optimize access to accessible materials and assistive and accessible technologies and tools. That obviously points to it. So, and that is the UDL. And then also consistency in language and functionality. And that's really important for a lot of groups of people, and it helps everybody. And then also instructions, not assuming that somebody's going to know exactly what to do when they get to a form, when they get to something. Just having really concise instructions really helps a lot. And then input assistance is also under that in the WCAG, and that mainly has to do with errors, error identification, prevention, and recovery. And in strategic development, that's in the UDL. It says that you plan for challenges. So that really speaks to that as well. And then for operable, the multiple means of action and expression, that's a UDL part again, and then interactions aligned with that. Keyboard navigation, I'll talk about more later. That's so important to be able to navigate with your keyboard. Also, you don't want people to have seizures if they watch your videos. That would be really bad. And you want to have accurate headings so people who can see and people who can't see will be able to jump to what they want, and they'll be able to skim easier. So robust, since I have robust in there, I have to say the R, or it would be po. So to make it poor, then interaction section, again, that has to do with robust.
Can I just add one thing to this? Which is that we could talk for hours about this particular thing. And there are lots of really great books out there that specifically look at universal design and universal design for learning in library contexts. And I want to share with you my favorite, which is this one. It is called Creative Inclusive Libraries by Applying Universal Design. It's by Carly Spina, and it came out in 2021 from the library, I think, a LITA guide, Library Information Technology Association, which is now part of CORE. And I am going to drop into the chat the title and the Roman and Littlefield link for it. I have found it to be a really invaluable guide for me because she goes through lots of different criteria, including universal design for learning and how you might apply it to library instruction programs too. Carly is wonderful and kind of the patron saint of this. So you should read her book.
Okay, thank you, panelists. So the next question I have here is for Lauren. How can curriculum and teaching practices be more inclusive of disabled students?
Thank you so much. This is Lauren. I just wanted to share, I think, a couple of practical things that I've taken on in my teaching practices. And so also probably to share that we're doing a lot of this already based on kind of practices and habits that were probably developed during COVID or really kind of perfected during COVID. But we are doing, like I said, a lot of this already. So continue to offer variety of modalities. So like even again, this panel is being recorded, right? And so there's a live panel, there's a recorded panel, giving attendees multiple ways to engage with that information, back to the universal design for learning of multiple means of representation, and allowing for choice in how to engage. So I like to do that in my teaching too. That includes recording videos and making on-demand teaching, offering the one-shots, which I think many of us in academic libraries and probably public libraries and school libraries do a lot of, just the one shot of 50 to 60 minutes in a classroom, but making that material, available ahead of time. If I'm having a worksheet, I bring a physical worksheet if it's in person. I also have a digital version of that to allow for students and attendees to engage physically or in digitally, depending on their preference. I like to give, again, students the choice for engaging too, in the same way of like responding and kind of interacting with me in class. Not every student is going to want to, immediately volunteer. Sometimes they need time to process, and they need time to give thought to their response. And so I give them the opportunity, if they're comfortable, to respond in person. I very rarely kind of call on a student and make somebody respond. And I also offer them an opportunity via digital formats, like if a poll or again on a digital worksheet or something like that. So it's really about the multiple ways of providing the information and then engaging with the information. I also want to say, since I've talked about providing materials, make sure that those materials are accessible. So a PowerPoint presentation, run it through an accessibility checker, add those headings that Tammy was just talking about to even a PowerPoint presentation, putting the alternative text into the images to make sure that that it's accurately described of what's happening in the image, and don't have videos, again, auto running, because you want to let people know that that kind of media is coming forward. So I'm always trying to make my materials as accessible as possible. As well, I offer kind of QR codes and short URLs to be able to more easily engage with that content. I also think a lot about classroom design, which we may or may not have control over in our different settings, right? It's our built environment. There's a lot of cost that goes into it. But thinking about the way kind of the furniture is set up and making sure there's a pathway for ingress and egress. If we can have adjustable height furniture for those who want to use adjustable height furniture, a variety of seating options, both armed and armless, to give folks, again, that variety of decisions to choose from. Also thinking about the lighting and kind of the way screens are set up, and trying to kind of manage the glare factor and all the ways that kind of light sensory input happens. I try and think a lot about that. Again, not always able to control it, but if I'm able to dim lights in a classroom, I try and do that. I tell my students as well, this is their classroom. I want them to be comfortable. If they need to get up and stretch, if they need to go to the bathroom, I make that very clear as part of my practice. And to something Katie talked about, the kind of community of care and thinking through the ways we approach this work. Also, something big is the technology in the classroom, which I sometimes walk into a space and I don't know if there's going to be a microphone or a way to project or whatnot, but really trying to kind of ask those questions beforehand and work with facilities colleagues in the spaces that I can control to make sure that technology is available. What else do I want to say? And then just when teaching, speak slowly as much as possible, use accessible files to share the information, put up captions if you can, if you are doing a presentation. That way you can have both your voice speaking as well as the words kind of scrolling through on a screen if you have access to a screen. Of course, we probably all have thoughts about the AI generated captions and their accuracy. And I think we probably all know that they're not 100% accurate. So it's really best to to have a human to do the captioning, but we do have those AI tools kind of at the moment that are better, sometimes, in my opinion, than nothing. And then I just like to say too, when doing hybrid or kind of remote sessions, or if there's just a large classroom, to repeat the questions that come up from the group and be able to kind of make sure everybody can hear that. So using, again, technology and microphones and projecting as much as possible. Thanks.
So I'd like to open up any other panelists in the group if you want to add more to this question.
Sure. So I don't teach in the classroom quite as much as I used to, but I do a lot of events. And to me, that's a teaching exercise as well. And it was fun listening to Lauren just run through all the things you should think about, because we have an author talk series, and we completely redesigned the author talk series using universal design as our framework. And it is nothing like what it was before, and it's a lot more fun for everybody. So, it's the kind of thing where it takes some time to rethink it. You're always better off doing this from the start, but if you have to stop and say, now I want to make this more accessible, it is possible. One of the things, though, is that as librarians, I think in one shots, if we only get one shot, we want to teach the students everything in that one shot. But we know that doesn't work, right? Because we know that they don't retain everything that we give them. And what's really interesting is that the more you pack into a person's brain, the less they're going to retain about it, especially if we have an understanding that not everybody has the same brain. And so one of the things that I would encourage you to think about in making your classroom more accessible is to really consider what your learning outcomes are and teach less. And really think about what is the one thing I want them to get out of this, and do it through universal design calls of those multiple modes. So the multiple modes of presentation, the multiple modes of learning, and the multiple modes of demonstration of knowledge acquisition. And I would also say that you probably should have two things. One of them is the thing that you want them to learn. And maybe that is how to do a search in Science Direct, right? But the other one is that you want them to come away with an affective outcome. So you want them to feel good about what happened. You want them to feel like you are a person who will help them with their next question. And the way that you do that is not by the fire hose of information at them. It's by really thinking hard about how do I meet them where they are and respond to what they need. And Lauren did a great job of describing what all that was.
So our next question, this is also for Lauren. How can students, educators, and administrators work together to advocate for disability justice in their institutions?
Thank you. This is Lauren. So I think many of our organizations probably have committees and have kind of groups working towards disability justice or kind of supporting accessibility. So just to encourage you to join those groups if you're not already a member of them. And if they don't exist, to start those groups in your, either in your library or in your organization. And some ways to start that could be by just getting out there and doing a tour of who's doing this kind of work or interested in this kind of work in your organization. If you're in a higher education organization, meeting with students and understanding what their needs are. I know we had a disability student union where I was previously at New York University, and I would meet with them once a semester to kind of understand what their concerns were and how the library could kind of play a role in supporting them, to be able to offer the programming, to be able to offer and iterate upon the services that we were offering, and work with them to build that unity and to really kind of grow that advocacy network on campus. I want to say, volunteer for additional initiatives, like if there are petitions being signed or if there's programs being offered, join and be a part of that if committee work isn't fully something you can do. I like to invite conversations and partners into this work too. So I don't think my bio shared, but previously I was the accessibility and accommodations librarian at New York University. And part of my job was to make those connections and to liaise to those groups and really to talk about the work that I was doing and to, again, invite them in to understand how I could support them as well. And I, was fortunate enough to be at a place, and I'm still fortunate enough to have the ability to make accessibility a priority. Again, it was in my job description and title previously, but now it's still very much a part of the work I do. But if it's possible to advocate for that in your organizations and both in your libraries and in your universities or other organizational settings, to have that be kind of somebody's job responsibility. And I sat on a committee as well that hired the first ever director of disability inclusive culture for NYU. And that was really something amazing through this kind of grassroots organizing and advocacy that the university understood that a person needed to be paid to do this work and to lead this work in the organization. And lastly, I just want to say, to be able to advocate for this disability justice, we need to model the work. A lot of us, I think a lot of the details we're sharing on this panel today kind of are giving practical applications and frameworks and considerations in our work that make sure that our organizations are embodying this work in a variety of ways. So establish principles and practices within your libraries that support accessibility and include disability justice frameworks. We'll talk probably a bit more about more digital accessibility practices, but making sure our web content is accessible to users, that we're advocating, again, across the organization to make sure that information is as accessible as possible and delivered in platforms that are accessible. Make programs that are inclusive, and again, the teaching that we talked about in the last question, modeling that practice as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. And I want to open it up if any of the other panelists want to jump in on this question. No, okay. I think, Lauren, I guess you covered all of that. All right. So moving on to the next question we have. This one is for Tammy. So what are some overlooked ways that library technology and digital access create barriers for disabled users?
So many of our library databases do have accessibility barriers with their interfaces and the PDFs that you get from them. And, we're all busy and we're trying to look at ways to do things faster. And I know that some libraries use, say, if there's a VPAD, it's okay. But unfortunately, that's the vendor. Yes, they are finding things, but you don't know how thorough they are. The one that really set me aback is one time it said, since this is a web application, it's accessible. I was like, no. But you just don't know how thorough they are with the testing. And I don't know if you've heard of this before, so that's why I'm going to talk about just a teeny bit. The Library Accessibility Alliance, it's comprised of several groups, a lot of consortiums, and the e-resource testing group facilitates high-level testing with accessibility companies. And many of these reports can be found on their website. So that's nice. And due to the magnitude of resources, they can only do high level. That's all they can pay for is high level testing, but it covers, really urgent things that need fixed. So that's one thing that's really good. And I was just going to talk about a couple critical errors. It's really important you can navigate completely, do all the functionality with the keyboard. And you might ask why, and that's because not everybody can use mouse. This could be due to motor function. It could be due to someone who's blind. They can't see the things on the page, so they use the keyboard in order to navigate the page. And some databases, websites have input components that can't be accessed by the keyboard, which is bad. But then some of them have keyboard traps, which is even worse. So you tab to something and then you can't do anything. You have to exit and come back in because you can't navigate after that. So some of these are things that I saw in the reports that I was talking about. Inconsistent or unexpected behavior, because it's important because not everyone can troubleshoot or figure out what's going on easily, and not everybody can see what's going on. So when you don't notify people that you're going to open a new window or that if you select a checkbox and immediately does something and you don't tell them, it can be very difficult to figure out what's going on. So you want to make sure you tell them those kind of things. And if you can't tell what user interface component has focus, you can really have some kind of unexpected behavior. So I think I'm on a checkbox, but I'm really on a button, and then it goes somewhere else, and then I have no idea what's going on. So this could be due to poor contrast, or it could be a missing indicator, but if you can't see it, it's missing anyway. It doesn't really matter. So we already talked about a lot the images with alternative text. So if you have important text, you want to make sure that, well, you want all text to be clear, but then also you want it to be accessible to a screen reader. And also text box is not associated with label. So you tab to it, and then the screen reader wouldn't say anything. So you'd have no idea what you were going to type in there. And error messages that aren't read automatically by screen readers, or they're not clear, you want to make sure your error messages are very clear. And then of course there's the PDFs, which is a totally different animal of itself. And you want to make sure they're optical character recognition, they're not just images. You want to make sure they're tagged. The tags look a lot like HTML, and that tells the screen reader what they are, and they can give context to the user. And also wrong reading order. I know that I've seen with the 2 columns and it's read across, and it's just like, oh, you have no idea what it's talking about because it's not reading it the way that it's supposed to read it.
And I want to open up to the rest of the panel if any either to join in or jump in on that.
I think this is Lauren. I just wanted to add to, as in some of our libraries, we are creating our own digital platforms and technologies, and wanting to just, when we are building like institutional repositories and those kinds of things, thinking through those processes too, and how the platforms that we create can be made accessible and not putting up unintentional barriers to access, as well as the content that is distributed in those platforms, and what workflows and policies do we have in place to kind of help support making sure the content's accessible in those that we can control. Because vendors, again, just like PDFs is a very big conversation, but the conversation around the vendor licensing of all the access to things and the barriers through those, that's a big conversation too. But just a plug to maybe advocate for that with your vendors, and as small or big libraries, just say this is something you are prioritizing and you want the publishers to be kind of proactive in as well.
I would also say that when we made the shift to this kind of format because of the pandemic, that suddenly made professional development and learning available to people who don't have the ability to travel, and that felt great. But we know that this is an environment that's built by people who didn't necessarily have the needs of the full diversity of human disability and accessibility in mind. And so there are people who are in the social model disabled by Zoom in a way that they are not disabled by an in-person meeting. There are people who are disabled by a PDF who were not disabled by other formats of print or of transmitting information. And so that emphasis on having lots of different ways to access content is really important in the digital space as well as in the physical space. And I think that's a lot of what Tammy was talking about in thinking about how do people interact with this through means other than what the majority may think that you should be doing it with. So just to kind of pull together what both Lauren and Tammy were saying there, like this is an environment just like our other environments. We do have to think about the accessibility here and not just assume that because I can do this from home or from wherever I want, that and it's a 21st century technology, that it's inherently better than our pre-21st century technologies.
So I want to thank the panel today for answering those questions. And we have come to the conclusion of this part of the webinar, but we're going to move on to that great Q&A section.